Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Great. So I'm Jason Hill. I'm your host this evening for Suds in Science. How many of y'all, this is your first Suds in Science here? Fantastic. We have a tradition. You're all going to pick up the round for everybody else right afterwards. Come see me afterwards. American Express is preferred here. Okay. Thank you very much for showing up. This is a monthly science discussion series we do. We do this all the way through May, and it picks up again in November. And this is an opportunity to interact with scientists who conduct novel research, make that world-class science at a level that's approachable and digestible in a pretty comfortable setting. And I'm sure Tim would agree. This isn't meant to be a lecture as much as it is a discussion. If you have questions, ask them.
Please,
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say most scientists enjoy listening to themselves talk, but this is an opportunity for you to interrupt those scientists and take them down a notch. That won't be a problem with Tim. I'm a conservation biologist for the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies, and that's our executive director right there, Chris Rimmer. We are a local nonprofit, and we do original research here. Our research directly informs science. Our science directly informs management and conservation of our wildlife populations. In addition to Suds in Science, this series here. If you like this, I encourage you to check out our website, and I encourage you to think about supporting us. We could definitely use your help. I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Tim Duclos, and talk about the mountains by introducing another faraway ecosystem, the coastal marshes. So climate change in the mountains is happening sooner than it is at lower elevations and at an accelerated pace. We know this from advanced climatology instrumentation up there on the mountains and from recording when biological events happen year after year. But that's also happening at an accelerated pace at the lowlands right at the coastal level. And last year, some colleagues and I published a paper about salt marsh sparrows. Who has heard of salt marsh sparrows? Don't raise your hand, Tim. You better raise your hand. I mean, you better raise your hand, yeah. Salt marsh sparrows, as you know, some of you know, nest only in the lowland salt marshes right along the coasts from North Carolina up so into Maine. And then Nelson sparrow takes over from there. But we published a paper last year that's basically a mathematical model that estimates the probability of extinction of the species. And we think about extinction of species as being this slow process, or if you live in New Zealand, you think very differently about that. But it's something that we predict in our paper that will be something that most of us here will potentially observe in our lifetime for salt marsh sparrows. Sea levels are going to continue to rise no matter what UN projection you look at. And salt marsh sparrows breed on the ground in salt marshes, in between the ocean and basically Highway 1. And the other side of Highway 1 along the New England coast is expensive real estate. And that's not going to go anywhere very soon. So as sea levels continue to rise, those marshes are going to become underwater. And we estimate that it's just not going to be biologically possible for salt marsh sparrows to have successful reproduction in about 70 years. That's because they nest on the ground. Most of nest failure is due to flooding, and the marshes flood twice a day. So the chicks actually stand up out of the nest when they're like 3 days old and their eyes are closed, and the tide's coming in, and they put their head up and the tide goes down and they sit back down. But we estimate due to sea level rise and the inability of the marsh to move up into the landscape because there's infrastructure, roads and tidal gates and houses already there, there won't be salt marsh that's dry enough for salt marsh sparrows to nest in. By the end of this century, we predict reproduction won't be possible. So that's one extreme on the lowlands. And talking about the other extreme tonight will be Tim from the Northeast Climate Science Center, fellow from the Northeast Climate Science Center, talking about climate change and our wildlife populations in the mountains. Thank you, Tim, for being here.
Oh. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Chris, and the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies for having me here tonight. And thank you all for coming out. I hope you all still have some energy left in you after your town meeting day, that you all got out and voted and did your civic duty. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to stand in front of you and give this talk and talk about my master's work, which I recently completed at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I officially graduated this past September. I had been working on this project that I'm going to talk about tonight for the last 3.5 years, really. you know, and I got involved in this project after kind of serendipitously taking a plane ride while I was actually working at the Nature Conservancy. Lynn was my supervisor at that time in an AmeriCorps program. And I sat next to Kent McFarland's mother on a flight from Seattle, Washington to Delaware at the time. And, you know, she's like, "Do you know my son and the work he does?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've heard of Kent." She's like, "Well, I'll connect you." And that summer, I found myself on top of Mount Mansfield with Chris and Kent and folks at the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies banding Bicknell's thrush, and you know, learning from the professionals, experts themselves, about these unique species that exist at the very top of the Green Mountains. At the time, I was looking for an opportunity to get into graduate school and do research that was meaningful to me. It was time for that, and it really was meant to be, because, you know, I grew up here in Vermont in the Green Mountains, and I've long been hiking and backpacking in our mountains, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, hopefully have had similar experiences as I have in terms of just experiencing the unique characteristics of our mountains here. I mean, they may not be the tallest mountains by any means. You know, if I go to a conference and talk about our high elevation areas in the White Mountains, you know, people from the Rockies are gonna, you know, certainly put me in my place. But what is unique, at least here, relatively speaking, is that, and you can share with me this, like, and you'll see the point of this kind of exercise here, but think about, like, hiking from the bottom of a mountain to the top. Maybe think of, like, your favorite hike here, like Camel's Hump or Mount Mansfield, or over in the White Mountains, you know, going up Mount Washington. And think about the transition that occurs in the environment from the bottom to the top of the mountain. And this transition is one that really has always amazed me in hiking. And briefly, you think about, you start in the valley at the bottom of the mountain. You're probably in a deciduous hardwood community, you know, leafy trees, you've got maples, you've got oaks, you've got American beech. You start hiking up the mountain. It's pretty warm at the bottom, relatively speaking. Maybe it's June, it's 70 degrees. And as you hike up, gradually the forest changes, right? As you get up, maybe halfway up the mountain, let's say you're going up Camel's Hump, the maples drop away, the American beech drop away. You start seeing more paper birch, more yellow birch. You see some coniferous trees. You might see some red spruce starting to come up in the understory, and things are starting to get cooler as well, right? Hike up even higher on the mountain, and pretty soon the deciduous trees mostly drop away. You might still have some of the birch and the paper birch and the yellow birch, but really that red spruce forest starts to dominate, and you're soon approaching the top of the mountain, and you find yourself completely inside a red spruce balsam fir forest, right? In a very different environment than the one you started out in. If it's a mountain that's tall enough, let's say over 4,000 feet in elevation, you might get into a community near tree line that's known as the Krumholtz community, and it's completely, more or less completely, a fir community, you know, like Christmas trees essentially, balsam firs, and they might be they're likely very stunted and like grow really thickly. We call this the Krumholtz forest, and that's right before tree line, and that's a forest that is quite cool. It's very moist. There's a lot of ferns and or not a lot of ferns, more like mosses and lichens, and it's very different than the forest you started out on. And along the way, I realize I've completely omitted an important aspect of this. The animal community has changed, right? So at the bottom of the mountain, you might see ovenbirds, you might see different flycatchers. You see white-breasted nuthatch, birds that you associate with that forest. You see chipmunks, you see gray squirrels. But as you go up, that bird community changes, right? At some point, you might not see the eastern chipmunks anymore. You might still see the red squirrels. But by the time you get to the top, you have dropped away, or all those other birds have dropped away, and you have just a handful of new birds that you didn't see at the bottom. You might see the bicknells at the very top of the mountain in that Krumholtz forest I described. You might see a black-polled warbler at the top of the mountain, yellow-bellied flycatcher, red-breasted nuthatch, birds that are found nowhere else, but they're only found at the top of the mountain. Okay, so throughout my talk tonight, or my discussion, let's say, it's not a lecture, it's not a talk. I ask that you kind of refer to that imagery and that mountain landscape that I just kind of described. So with that in mind, that forest, that environment in mind, let's bring climate change into the picture. Over recent decades, many aspects of that environment has changed. We're seeing an increase in temperature and precipitation in our mountains here in the region. Some areas we've only seen a couple degrees, like half a degree of temperature increase. Other areas we've seen several degrees of temperature increase. Some mountains have warmed much more than others, but generally speaking, over the last several decades, last 50 years, let's say, the climate has really changed a bit in this area. That forest community is changing as well. There's evidence coming from multiple agencies and research groups to suggest that that hardwood community that I described is kind of moving upslope. And this has been shown to be the case in the Green Mountains, as well as looking at satellite imagery in over time measuring the forest in the White Mountains. And on the bird front, we're also seeing birds change where they live on the mountain as well. And I'll describe this as a change in their distribution. We're seeing there's evidence from my collaborators at UMass Amherst showing that from U.S. Forest Service data taken over several decades, as well as data gathered by the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies and their partners through the Mountain Birdwatch program, that birds are moving upslope. We're seeing these birds that used to occupy lower elevation zones also encroaching upslope. And at the same time, those species that are more or less relegated to those very high balsam fir areas, these areas that I might term islands in the sky because they are relatively unique and isolated compared to the surrounding landscape, we're seeing a decline in those species. So we're seeing a decline in Bicknell's thrush, black-polled warbler, yellow-bellied flycatcher, magnolia warbler, a lot of our species that we consider indicator species, or species that indicate the health of the forest community. And so where my research comes into this is with an eye towards climate change and trying to understand how climate change is impacting these birds through these changes in the environment, and importantly, what conservationists and resource managers like the Forest Service, for example, could do to help conserve and manage for these species in the future under different climate change scenarios, is my work seeks to understand how climate patterns in the mountains along that gradient of transition going up the mountain that I described as you hike up influences the pattern of abundance of individual species on the mountain, species of birds. And so additionally, my work kind of seeks to take a more comprehensive view of the role of climate in determining that pattern of abundance of individual species. You know, essentially where those species are and how many of them are there. In that I'm both looking at the direct effects of climate, meaning the direct association between that pattern of abundance in individual species and climate conditions. Climate here being temperature and precipitation predominantly during the breeding season in the summer, as well as indirectly how climate influences the forest community in these areas and what that means for the birds, given that forest is a habitat for these birds. And so I began my work gathering data in the summer of 2014, and my research area that I chose is in the White Mountains, which is very similar, you know, right over the river, more or less, from the greens here. And I came onto this project with a written proposal by my advisor that folks at the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies collaborated on, kind of brainstormed this project. So I adopted it, and it was decided that first summer that I would work on 10 mountains to gather data on bird abundance at select locations in these mountains, as well as temperature and forest conditions in the mountains. And the way in which we had to approach this study was to try to gather that, or really gather data that represents, to the best of our ability, that pattern of change that occurs across elevation. And so working on these 10 mountains, I hit the ground running as a one-man crew in May, with the goal of starting in June and doing all of my bird surveys in the month of June. And I selected, as fast as possible, 10 mountains around, including Mount Washington. And on each of these 10 mountains, I selected 10 sample locations along trails that go up these mountains. So that's 100 sites that I selected to collect data on bird abundance, temperature, as well as the forest conditions. And so the month of June, I went out, and has anybody here participated in the Mountain Birdwatch program? Anybody? Or anybody familiar with Chris? Well, if you haven't, then I suggest all of you to perhaps think about maybe, you know, trying it out. It's honestly how I initially learned about doing point counts. But essentially what it means is that I went to each of these locations early in the morning. I'd do one mountain a day. I'd go in at pre-dawn, and I would start hiking, and I'd go to the first location. I'd do a 10-minute count of all the birds that I saw and heard within 50 meters and outside of 50 meters, keeping track of each individual bird. And I would do that 10 times, hiking up the mountain, about, on average, 7-8 miles round trip. And I did that every day for 40 days. And all told, you know, that's several. The weather really worked out quite well, actually, because, you know, these birds, they do all their breeding more or less, or they most intensely breed during the month of June. And so, especially with an eye to publishing, you know, this work and obviously gathering the best data possible, I was under the gun, so to speak, to do this in that month. And I did, and it went great. I also, you know, during this time I had an array of temperature loggers that I put at all of these locations, these 100 locations, that allowed me to gather on an hourly rate the temperature at each location in a synchronized manner. So at night I would just think about, you know, all of these temperature loggers across the White Mountain region gathering every hour, like temperature, temperature, temperature. You know, at the end of the season I had about 500,000 records of temperature. It was incredible, and nobody, nobody in this way had done this before, and it was really cool. You know, it worked out really well. At the end, after the breeding season, I went out and I measured not temperature, but I measured the forest characteristics at each location, all told, hugging effectively about 6,000 trees. And so I measured all these various aspects of the forest, right? And so that first season was a great success. During the academic year, I had a serious crash course in statistics and modeling. What's a model? Well, I found out what a model is. And put together a committee, and they decided, okay, next summer you did 10 mountains awesomely on your own that first summer. How about you do 5 more mountains? So that next summer, I was able to hire a crew of 2 stellar young female scientists that joined me, and we went out and selected 5 more mountains, and we did 450 point counts.
Still in the whites?
Still in the whites, yes, yeah. So I worked on Mount Washington, Adams, Monroe, Crawford, Eisenhower, Pierce, Jackson, some of the most prominent mountains in the area. Drove several thousand miles in my car and up and down Mount Washington. And so the second field season went great. I also did a bit of squirrel trapping that summer as well, which is kind of a new thing. I partnered with another academic at UMass Amherst who was interested in a question of the degree to which squirrels move up and down the mountain. And this is also a question born out of work conducted by the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies. They had found, after monitoring Bicknell's nest with video cameras, that squirrels are a major predator of Bicknell's eggs, as well as other bird eggs up there. And they're particularly bad in years in which their population surges following a masting year. So when the spruce cones put out a lot of cones, or the spruce trees put out a lot of cones. And so she, being a mammal ecologist, and me being in the mountains, decided that we'd go and we'd collar red squirrels and follow them around the mountain and using telemetry. And so, being a 2-man crew, I went out and trapped red squirrels up and down Mount Washington, learned how to handle a red squirrel. These are live traps, by the way. Squirrels are really hard to handle. They don't like being handled. And you have to be very gentle with them because, if you hold them too tight, they have a hard time breathing. If you hold them too loosely, they turn around their skin and they take off. Or bite you, yes. But we were able to put out a modest number of 8 collars that summer, all that we had. And after doing all the bird work, I then went out routinely and I tracked squirrels across Mount Washington through the Krumholtz with a telemetry unit, which was an adventure in its own right, certainly, thrashing through the Krumholtz, trying to follow a signal that's bouncing off rocks and different topographic features. Meanwhile, the squirrel knows that you're coming after it and is continuing on its on its journey to avoid you, while you, trying to be a diligent scientist, want to get eyes on the squirrel to confirm that's the right squirrel. It all worked out. We got some really interesting data, which is to say they don't really move too much. They like where they're at. Did see a couple of them take off, but we certainly did not find that they were doing any migration up or down the slope, movement up and down the slope, at least during the summer and into the fall, before the collars ran out of batteries. But anyhow, it was a very successful summer. It was a lot of fun. And from there, I went back to school. I applied my knowledge of statistics and modeling. And essentially, at the end of the day, what I found was, and I'll spare you the details of the statistics, but we gathered a robust amount of data that has really impressed reviewers on my publication that is in the works. But what we found, I used structural models in a novel way. And these models allowed me, with my data, to really effectively tease apart and answer the question of to what degree do individual bird species along these elevational gradients, do their population or their abundance patterns relate to patterns of temperature, as well as, and I was able to get precipitation data for the area as well, to what degree these patterns of their abundance also correlate, or in better terms almost associate with certain patterns of temperature up and down the mountain. I was able to discover that for many species they do indeed, their population or their individual abundances do fluctuate across the mountain landscape based upon temperature as well as precipitation. And for all of these species, and I ended up submitting for publication these results for 13 species representing birds that occur at the bottom all the way to the top. For all species, they all associate significantly with a particular habitat type, and all of them experience indirect effects of climate through that habitat type. So in other words, all of the species I looked at are affected by climate because the climate influences in part the forest that they depend upon. And for about 3/4 of those species, they also, within the context of that forest habitat, also have patterns that indicate that they also are following certain temperature and precipitation conditions. And that is really, really interesting. On one level, I'll be honest and say it's kind of like duh, right? Or at least to me. But it had never been, it's been looked at in different ways, but never in a comprehensive framework like this, and never with a robust data set like the one that I was able to gather, if I do say so myself. And the implications on one level is that going into the future, we really need to conserve forest habitat for these species. And there's hope there, given that these birds do have such a close association with forest conditions, and that forest ecologists are telling us that the forests are going to change at a slow rate over the next decade, because forests are long-lived, trees are long-lived species, and they're not completely affected solely by climate. It's about soils, it's about disturbance, other processes that are occur along a greater time frame. But in a much shorter time frame, we do predict to see a very rapid change in climate. And for those species that I found, which are the majority of them were directly affected by climate, those species may be really particularly vulnerable to that rapid change in climate in conjunction, or despite the fact that they depend upon a forest type that may change at a slower rate. And so all told, it's a very complex story that the way in which climate influences these birds, and that the changes that are potentially or very likely going to occur in the next century, let's say, in terms of climate change and change in forests, they're going to change at different rates that are going to have impose differing constraints upon these birds. In trying to understand how birds are going to exactly, or not exactly, but likely change under climate change, the models used now either assume that birds are just going to track changes in forests, or they're just going to track changes in climate. And from my work, it shows that we need to really look at both at the same time, and that really, nature, true to its fact, is a complex and interconnected web of factors. And to the best of our ability, we really need to think about how we can better model that and better predict how these birds are going to be affected by climate change. So that's the bulk of it. None of you asked any questions at all. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Yes.
Yeah. So that's some serious, it sounds like you got some really good data there in terms of the temperature monitoring and all the stuff that you do. And I'm thinking of the implications of big data, and I'm wondering if you fooled around with that at all.
Big data?
I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of data there that you could potentially merge with other stuff and see what the implications are even beyond the whole temperature and the bird thing. I mean, have you looked at, has anybody said, jeepers, that's a lot of, can we do something else with that?
Yeah, I mean, my collaborators have my data. They're using it. For example, the woman the professor I was working with, Tony Lynn Morelli, is using my observations on red squirrels in conjunction with Mountain Birdwatch data to model red squirrel distribution and changes over time. The thought, no, I mean, let me see, somebody else used my data out of the University of Maine to look at a regional scale, the distribution of birds. Nobody else is.
Temperature. I mean, it sounded like you got a lot of readings on temperature.
I did, yes. And the data's there. It's open. It's accessible. Nobody else has used it yet. To be honest, I have.
Nothing to pass compare it with, right? This is like a first time.
At this scale, yes, yeah. I mean, there's data that has been I don't want to use the technical term. Interpolated is the technical term. Basically, we have some understanding of the temperature conditions in these mountains from by statistically predicting from regional weather stations what the temperature in these mountains are like, and certainly the Weather Observatory on top of Mount Washington's got an array of temperature stations, but there's not much to compare it with really on the ground. It's really fine scale on the ground data.
Your data sets for 2 years are fantastic.
Yes.
But most of the time, big data sets require a term of, say, at least 10 years and maybe longer to be really important.
Yeah.
To account for the year-to-year fluctuations and so you can develop a trend.
Yep.
So I'm wondering, are these sites ever going to be continuously monitored for those variables that you've been measuring or not?
Yeah, absolutely. This summer, actually, we're hoping to go back out and resample these sites. And this really is, it is only a snapshot. And when I talk about birds responding to climate, or these patterns of birds and climate change, this is just more or less a static snapshot of that pattern across the mountain. You go up a mountain, you see more birds, and it gets colder. We model that as a correlation. But really, what the power of this, I think, will be to resample these sites and try to replicate this study and look at these changes over time. Yeah. Yep.
So Jason started out talking about salt marsh and how it had no ability to migrate inland.
Mm-hmm.
What about your upper limits where you're in the Krumholtz zone?
Yes.
Did you have any sense of whether that has the ability to migrate up the mountain?
Well, it's
habitat for those birds that use it.
It's at a lot of these. There's probably not much, if any, soil in a lot of these areas, and that's why to a certain extent, there is the tree line where it is. I mean, part of it is the harsh climate.
But if it was warmer, would the tree line go up?
I mean, in theory, if it was just about temperature, yes, the tree line would expand, but it's largely also about soils. I mean, there's a lot of, you paint this picture, you talk about, it's simplified, but it's much more complex than that. You talk about the influences, or the things that influence forest. It's disturbance, it's succession, it's soils, it's pests. There's a lot of different aspects than just climate that influence forest dynamics. I would be willing to say that the tree line as it is now is largely limited by lack of soils up there. So, yes?
I think I understood you to say that some bird species were responding more to climate than to forest conditions, forest-type conditions?
That some of them were responding to climate in addition to forest conditions, about 3/4 of them. Overall, the strongest response is to forest type and not the climate conditions.
Could you give us a little sense of the different species,
yeah,
randomly maybe?
Yeah, so You know, I looked at blackpoll warblers, as well as myrtle warblers, yellow-bellied flycatchers, red-eyed vireos, black-throated blue warblers, dark-eyed juncos, Blackburnian warblers, black-capped chickadee. So that's a taste of the species, and all of those species, except for the dark-eyed junco, Blackburnian warbler, and black-throated blue warbler, experienced both direct and indirect effects. But the dark-eyed junco and the Blackburnian warbler and black-throated blue warbler, for some reason, yet to be discovered, only experienced indirect effects of climate. Yeah.
Explain what does that mean if they only experience indirect?
It means that their populations only significantly correlated with forests that are in turn determined by climate. But within the context of the forest habitat that's suitable for them, there is no indication, or at least statistically significant indication, that the patterns of their abundance additionally were influenced by temperature or precipitation. Yes?
So in the literature, have you found other researchers who have comparable data in other parts of the country that you can compare?
Yeah, so there's comparable data in terms of like the looking at kind of the direct and indirect effects of climate, you mean? Or like,
comparing your data set with those circumstances with other research data that exists elsewhere.
Yeah, so an easy example is work done out of UC Davis in the Sierra Nevadas. They've got a really awesome data set, given that Grinnell, one of the originals, like went out at the beginning of the century, or the 19th century, 20th century, and surveyed much like this up and down mountains and counted and recorded all the birds that he saw. And they've gone out and resurveyed these same mountains, and they found very similar changes in terms of the distribution of birds. They found a lot of birds have moved upslope, and that pattern has been seen in the Andes, in the Himalayas, and in mountains all over the world. For that study, the one that Morgan Tingley and his colleagues have done out of UC Davis, they found that a lot of these birds were following increases in precipitation as well as changes in temperature. And so that's kind of a comparable study. Although in his work, they didn't look at the forest component like I did, or at least they didn't do it, or they also didn't do it side by side. They were largely just looking at the climate. But there is other work that looks, or is very similar to, the findings are very similar to mine, yes. Yes?
So where birds are being directly affected by climate as well as the habitat, are they being affected in a way where they all have similar preferences, so they're all exploiting the same habitat, or are there specialists looking at different niches, different climate niches within a community?
That's a really good question, and my methods thus far have not been able to delve that deep into it. I will say that within the same community, maybe this kind of answers your question. You know, I found some high elevation birds. One that comes to mind is like the myrtle warbler, the yellow rump warbler. You know, this is one that occurs at higher elevations. It does go a bit further down the mountain than some of our high elevation species like the blackpoll, and certainly, you know, compared to the bicknells. You know, that species, it was interesting because I found that, you know, it had both a positive effect of or a negative effect of temperature, meaning that you know, as temperature increased, the species declined, but as precipitation increased, it also declined, which is kind of on the mountainside, kind of two conflicting things. So it's almost like there's this optimum for this one species, whereas others that occupy a similar habitat just generally, like, you know, follow the norm where they, you know, colder environments higher up in the mountain is better for them, wetter environments higher up the mountain is better for them. And so again, it's a very complex story, And certainly as climate changes and as forests change, these different aspects of the environment are going to change in different ways at different rates for different species that are going to mean that those species are going to be affected in very odd ways, which then in turn, you think about competition that could influence other species on the landscape. It's a very dynamic system and it's interconnected. So I kind of answer your question, I'd say.
You didn't mention Swainson's. Did you look at Swainson's?
I did look at Swainson's. That is another one. I admitted that was an interesting species in that Swainson's, they have been moving upslope a bit. And in fact, there's some thought that they're like kind of encroaching on Bicknell's thrush habitat. In fact, there's a study out of the Adirondacks that show that they're like competitors, right? I mean, we know that they're competitors, but that there's this competitive interaction that occurs between them. Swainson's are one of those that kind of it was hard to model because they exist across the entire mountain landscape, and they seem to be kind of generalist in their habitat association as well as the climate conditions. So just knowing that, I think that they will do better than others, given that generalist preference. In fact, I tried to study them one summer in 2016. And I was, netting them and putting bands on them and trying to follow them, trying to understand if they have territories and try to follow them to nests. And they were like herding cats. Like they're just all over the place and like impossible to try to track down and follow. And my advisor and I were like thinking like, are these kind of like Bicknells? Or they have like fluid territories where they're, it was very interesting. And so he's still working on that, and they're an interesting species for sure. There's a question back there. Yes?
So we have these birds that are negatively impacted, assumedly negatively impacted by climate change. Forgive me for being crass, but
yep.
What do we do next? What policy changes should be set into place, in your opinion, as the researcher on this data set?
Yeah. So,
repeat the question? It was a little hard to hear.
Like, what can we do about it? Like policy changes, broadly, like what can we do to conserve these species? And the silver lining to all this is that the areas that I worked in and a lot of the areas that these high elevation birds, for example, occupy are on federal land that can be managed and can be protected. And so the goal in doing the work that I'm doing and my colleagues are doing is by trying to understand the ecology of these species and trying to then statistically model, how they're going to respond to climate change. The thought is we can identify areas of the mountain that we'd consider climate refugia, areas that are potentially going to change a lot less than the surrounding landscape, where these birds can potentially occupy and resist or adapt to climate change. And so that I would say is what we should focus on, is trying to identify these areas and then try to protect these areas. Or potentially we could think about adaptive silviculture, trying to plant trees or trying to manipulate the forest so that the conditions are most favorable for these species to adapt or resist. Yes?
I have to push back on that. How,
please.
If it's a climate issue, how is the fact that it's on a federal land going to change what the climate regime is there?
I'm saying that we can protect areas from development potentially. Okay. Wind turbines, or we could not lease the land to a ski area. And so just the thought of just having the opportunity to protect, to make decisions about these high elevation areas gives us at least that opportunity.
But if the driver is changing climate, there's still some serious risks. Right.
There is, right. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that one thing we can change or try to protect is the habitat, right? So right. We might not, we don't have direct control over the climate, but we can try to protect the habitat. Yes?
So I think some of the bird species that you mentioned are migratory species, and of course, one way that climate stresses those species is the seasonal changes, the earlier spring in particular, and the timing of those migrations. But you're studying in June, so it sounds like you're not capturing that impact on those populations. Can you, do you have insights into that problem facing those species?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, we talk about phenological change, right? So the phenology is like the timing of leaf out, it's the timing of departure of snowpack. It's just the cycle and the timing of events. And resident species or you know, species that live close to where they breed or even in the same areas as their breeding grounds, they can adapt or they can respond to leaf out or insect availability, basically favorable conditions, so they can choose to take advantage of earlier, you know, earlier springs and warmer weather, and start initiating breeding. And they might even, you could say that in that way they even have a competitive advantage over long distance migrants that are constrained by their physical condition on the breeding ground or the wintering grounds, their ability to then you know, fly very long distance, like the black-polled warbler, for example, is flying thousands of miles over the ocean, or you know, otherwise, to get back from its breeding or its wintering grounds, it has to deal and combat all the conditions along the way, and it can't respond to it can't predict or know that I should have or could have been here 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And so in that way, you know, some of these species, especially long-distance migrants, may be at a disadvantage because of that.
And that might be an explainer of the dwindling population size that you see, even if it correlates also to the temperature in June or to the habitat conditions.
Exactly. I mean, that's a constraint. That may be, that's one potential of many avenues of how these birds are declining. I mean, I can't stand up here and not say that for the bicknells, for example, they've lost a significant amount of their wintering habitat down in the Dominican Republic, and you know, we can do all, not to be like sad or you know, we can do everything perfectly here on the breeding grounds to take care of these species, but if we can't affect the habitat, preserve and protect the habitat and their wintering grounds, you know, we can only do half as much. You know, they need that as well. So, yes.
Kind of to segue off of that, I don't know a lot about atmospheric science, but would wind patterns and other things be a concern as far as migration and influencing the way that climate changes and affects different wind patterns?
Wind patterns. I mean, birds take advantage of favorable winds during migration. They certainly are really thrown off by extreme weather events, hurricanes. For example, and under climate change or with climate change, we are seeing and we're going to expect to see an increase of those extreme events. And so if those events happen during migration, birds are going to be negatively impacted.
But in a more general sense, I guess I had seen just a little bit of research last year about some of the weather pattern changes because of temperature change and other factors that affect whole atmospheric patterns, and would that affect migration?
If the wind patterns change, then yes, it would affect the birds. But I can't really speak in depth to what I know about the potential for changing weather patterns. I mean, I know that, or wind patterns rather. I do know that wind is largely driven by North Atlantic oscillation, which, you know, could potentially be affected if things get bad enough. But I'll leave it there. I guess. Yes.
To get to your study areas, you were using trails, and did you see any effect of that disturbance on distributions?
It's a good question. Yeah, I was working off of trails, and I came into the study being really confident that trails would work would be representative of the bird community, or rather data gathered from stations on trails would be representative of the bird community, meaning that trails don't have an effect. And the reason why I was confident in that is my predecessor, Bill DeLuca, had just finished his PhD in part looking at that on the same routes that I was working on. So he didn't find an impact. I will say that out west they've done some studies that suggest that indeed trails, especially the wider they get, I mean these are pretty thin, they're not very wide trails, but out west there is some evidence that trails do affect bird community. So, yes, yeah.
You've been talking about the effect, you're studying the effects on birds and some squirrels. I was wondering if anyone's studying like herps, like reptiles, amphibians, or other animals in the area and their patterns.
Yeah, I know some researchers down at UMass Amherst who are herpetologists that are looking at amphibians, and I don't know extensively about their work, but I do know that amphibians in general with climate change, these are species that they emerge after the first, a lot of them, they go dormant in the wintertime, go into the mud, and they emerge after the first warm rain in the spring. And you can imagine if you get a warm rain, at the end of February and you come out and then it freezes the next day, we are seeing that kind of mortality where amphibians are emerging too early, and that's another that relates back to the change in phenology, right? The timing of these critical life events for species. They've evolved over time. This strategy, assuming a predictive or a predictable or a dependable weather climate condition, and so with increased variability in our weather, species are really at a disadvantage, like amphibians. Yeah. Yes.
Of your 13 bird species, which would you say have the narrower ranges up and down, movement up and down the
definitely Bicknell's thrush. I mean, they're the most habitat constrained, in fact, to the point where even in my extensive work, I was not confident that I captured their population well enough to submit it for publication, or just the data, because they are true habitat specialists among all of these species. They occupy, these Krummholz forests, which are, relatively speaking, just a small portion of the overall mountain landscape.
So were they one of your 13, or
they're not for publication? No. Yeah.
Of the 13, then, are there others that would be similarly constrained, but maybe not so extremely?
The blackpoll warbler would be another one, because that's another habitat specialist. I mean, I guess to a degree they're all habitat specialists, but that's one that is particularly closely associated with the balsam fir community up there. Yeah. Yes.
So how do you figure out how much predation the red squirrels are impacting the birds?
Predation? The best way is to put cameras on the nest. But without direct observation, it comes down to statistics again. I guess if you were to design a study, you would intensely monitor a series of nests on a plot, and you'd monitor the population of red squirrels, and you would do that over several seasons. And if you see an increase in squirrels and a decrease in nest success, then most ecologists, if they feel like they've isolated all of their variables, would be willing to posit that it's the squirrel predation. But really, it's the best way is, the most confident way is through monitoring. I mean, you can tell if you go up to a nest that you've been monitoring over time, without cameras, and if there's shells on the ground, it's likely a squirrel. It could be another bird, because corvids, for example, crows will predate nests. Gray jays, blue jays will predate nests. So it's not necessarily a squirrel, but it's hard. Yeah. Yes.
What were your favorite mountains?
Yes. My favorite mountain is probably going up Mount Adams is my favorite, you know. And I'd go up the Lowe's Path is my way up, and I'd stay at Grey Knob when I'd go up there to do my surveys. You know, I'd do 3 surveys a season, so I'd hike each mountain 3 times to count birds. In the middle time, I would hike up the night before and camp, and then start my surveys at the top and go down. And that's to control for time of day. And so I'd go up and stay in the cabin up there.
The mountain or the cabin?
Both. Both. It is. That's a good question, but it's both. It's both, for sure. Yeah.
The top without a whole lot of vegetation, that's very rocky.
It is, yeah. I was really fortunate in that before I started this study, Kent McFarland hired me on to do a study of white mountain fritillary butterflies, which are an endemic species only found on the top of Mount Washington. And he had a permit, or around Mount Washington as well, and he had a permit to collect data at like 150 sites in the alpine zone all around Mount Washington. And so I was able to just hike around anywhere for like 2 weeks up there. And it was quite an awesome experience. I really appreciate the alpine zone. Found a plane crash up there, actually. It was really interesting, but I don't know, I do love the whites, so.
So was Ken fine with the fact that his mom introduced you?
Yeah, no, that was wonderful, yeah. Yeah, and honestly, it was meant to be because, you know, I was really looking for an opportunity to get on a research project with a great group of people, doing something that meant something significant to me and gave back, and it was really the right project for me and a right group of people. And it all probably happened largely because I sat next to his mom on a plane.
So what's your next step?
My next step, still on the continual pursuit for a permanent job. It's hard in conservation. Right now I'm working with the state of Vermont, Fish and Wildlife Department out of Springfield, doing fisheries work actually. And so I've got that right now. And I've got a couple other job prospects. I'm always begging VCE to
retire in a few years.
Yeah. Chris always says that Kent's also on, you know, I could always take over Kent's job. But anyhow, I hope to stay in Vermont and to continue to give back in any way I can, do conservation here, and hopefully do research as well as be a part of on-the-ground work, because that means a lot to me also, to be a part of on-the-ground conservation action as well. So we'll see. Yeah. Yes?
So if you were going to take the research you just did and kind of follow the next question,
yes,
where would that lead you?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny, I've reflected a lot about this, obviously about this experience, and you know, I learned a lot along the way, and I realized probably, you know, there's a lot to be described in terms of, you know, how does climate have an influence upon birds through this direct pathway? So not the forest, but like what mediates climate and its influence on birds. And I think that first and foremost, it's probably prey availability, the insect community. A lot of these birds are insectivorous, you know, and, you know, insects being ectotherms, you know, it's logical that they would be vulnerable to fluctuations in temperature and precipitation. And so I think it'd be really awesome to do a similar study, but through the lens of the insect community, and see what these birds are eating, and to see if there's any fluctuation in the prey community as temperature varies across the mountain landscape. That's one thought. So.
You got it. That's the point.
Yeah, because you know, yeah, what can I say? You know, the direct effects of climate, it's a really good start, you know, and that's how science, you know, somebody described it to me as each research project's like a brick in, you know, a foundation, right? And each one has got its value in terms of giving us a little bit of information on which to lay that next brick in the next study. And, you know, it was a, you know, I think at the very least, this work, you know, presents a foundation for how we can approach such an analysis. It provides the basis for repeating these surveys into the future to look at how these changes happen over a time, you know, over time. And it certainly has spurred many ideas as to what we can chip away next. You know, one thought being the insect community. So, yeah.
Well, I'd just say on behalf of everybody, thank you for coming out tonight, supporting science and supporting Tim's research. I'm sure Tim would be happy. $5 a question, stick around and talk to you. And thank you, Tim, very much.
Well, thank you.